Okay, there we go. Good. Okay, are we ready to go? Excellent. Okay, welcome. Hello, everyone. Everyone watching in YouTube land, everybody on different streamers, welcome. Welcome to everybody watching and welcome to our incredible panel. I'm Andrea Houston, managing editor of Ricochet Media. I'm really pleased and honored to host today's panel discussion on investigating Airbnb and short-term rentals. Earlier this month, Ricochet Media, in partnership with Pivot Media in Quebec, launched. Welcome to everybody watching and welcome to our incredible panel. Sorry, my apologies. I'm not sure if the delay there would, is on which screen, so I think I figured it out. Okay, apologies. Thank you to everyone for being patient while we figure out these technical difficulties. As Brishti said, it wouldn't be a YouTube panel without figuring out technical difficulties. So as I was saying, last month, Ricochet Media launched an exciting investigation into Airbnb. I invite you to check out more information on this by going to our website at ricochet.media and read more about it. We are crowdfunding right now to pay 4 journalists a living wage in different parts of the country, 1 in Toronto, 2 in Quebec, and 1 on the West Coast. You will hear from 2 of them in just a few moments. And so thank you for everyone who has donated to our crowdfunder so far. And if you can make a contribution, if you haven't already, please do. The GoFundMe is live. Every donation gets us closer. And we want to hear from you. If you're at home or you know someone who has been rent evicted or pushed out of your apartment, so the landlord can turn around and turn it into an Airbnb. It's an old story. If you know somebody, or maybe you have had this happen to you, shoot us an email at editor@ricochet.media. So to get right into it, we all know that when Airbnb was first introduced to Canadians, it was sold to us as a solution to the housing crisis for individuals and working families to rent out a basement or a suite in your house, make some extra cash. But that is no longer the case, and it hasn't been for a long time. Airbnb is now essentially a hotel operator, a conglomerate of sorts, and we need to find out how this all connects. We need to connect those dots for Canadians. Airbnb is at the center of what is an ever worsening housing crisis. Short-term rentals sorry, one second. Downtown living. Okay. Airbnb is at the center of the housing crisis. Airbnb takes affordable units off the rental market. They drive up rents. It speeds up neighborhood gentrification. And in 2009, according to reporting from the Globe, we know that Airbnb took 31,000 units out of Canada's rental stock. And so that's why we launched this investigation. We have questions as newsrooms, and so we want to hear from you. We want to talk more about this, and we want to get to the bottom of it. And so that's why we've assembled this incredible team of journalists. And so I want to go around our panel now and give everybody a chance to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about why you feel so connected to this issue. What are the questions that you have, and what is it that you would like to see this investigation reveal? So joining me is my colleague and co-editor, Ethan Cox, from Ricochet Media, journalists Brishti Basu and Zachary Kamel, who are on the team of investigators looking into this issue. Jordy Dent, Executive Director of the Federation of Metro Tenants Association. and Thorben Weinditz from Airbnb Canada, excuse me, and Murray Cox, founder of Inside Airbnb. Thank you all for joining us today. Really exciting. First, I want to go to the journalists, and maybe I'll go to Brishti first to start things off. So Brishti, over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. So my name is Brishti Basu. I'm an investigative freelance journalist based in Victoria, BC, and I'll be looking into Airbnbs and short-term rental regulations in BC. For the past couple of years, I've been looking first. An echo. Okay. For the past couple of years, I've been investigating housing, healthcare, and social inequalities in Victoria, BC. And while I haven't looked into Airbnb specifically, I've been affected by the issue. In 2018, my roommates and I were told to leave our apartment because the landlord said she wanted to sell the house, but a few months later, we found that same property listed on Airbnb. So this issue is close and personal to me. And I know that there are lots of people who are in a precariously housed situation right now because they were forced out of their homes. So my interest is looking into person first, human first stories, looking at which politicians have a stake in the issue, trying to do some kind of accountability journalism, and I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Excellent. Now, Zach, I'm going to throw it over to you. Zach did some of the most incredible journalism in the lead up to this investigation, along with Ethan, really digging into that fatal, tragic fire in Montreal. So I'm going to let him explain some of the context that really brings us up to this point.
Hi, my name is Zachary Kamel. I'm a freelance investigative reporter based in Montreal. And so back in March, there was a fire in Old Montreal in which 7 people died. And as the story was breaking, there were reports that the building had been converted into illegal short-term rentals. And it also impacted the search and rescue efforts because as the fire broke out, there was reports of 1 missing because they weren't able to confirm how many people were actively in the building. So I began looking into the fire several days after it broke out, and I was able to pretty quickly figure out who was renting those units. And then within a matter of days, I was able to see the scope of the network within that building, and it spread over at least 3 buildings and almost 21 units, I think. So it's just, and they were all illegal rentals. So it just shows some of the impacts that these short-term rentals could have on people renting, safety issues when they're not regulated properly. And so that's part of the reason that I'm really interested in this. And the other fact is just the state of housing, in Montreal, across Canada, it's a crisis. And when housing becomes financialized or there's big profits to be made, then it no longer serves its main purpose, which is housing people. So I'd like to see how deep those networks are and who's really profiting off of the conversion of long-term rentals to short-term rentals.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zach. Ethan, over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. So, I was working with Zach as his editor on some of that amazing journalism that he was doing in the wake of the fire in Montreal. And obviously, it's no surprise to anybody that housing is one of the most salient issues right now. We are in the midst of a housing crisis. Anyone who lives in a downtown is familiar with it. I certainly live in a place where I feel under siege, where all of the buildings around me are being gutted. My neighbors are being reno-evicted. And I think when Zach was chasing that reporting that he did, he was able very successfully to expose the role of Emile Benamor, the landlord of that building that burned, and of about 20 other buildings and close to 100 units, many of which were being illegally rented on Airbnb. and of some of the entrepreneurs like Tariq Hassan, who was running the units in that building. But I think it was very clear to both of us that this was really just the tip of the iceberg. That this was just one instance of one illegal hotel, one proprietor, one landlord, and Emil Benamor probably, hopefully, is going to face some consequences here. He's being sued by families of some of the people that died, and certainly there's a great deal of scrutiny on him. But that was really the tip of the iceberg. So we started looking at how can we expand this? How can we deal with this problem at scale, at scope? How can we really look into the role of Airbnb across the country in this housing crisis that we're experiencing? And that's how we got to this project. And it was very ambitious to hope that we'd be able to get people to fund for journalists across the country in English and French to do this journalism. But I think it's necessary. And I think the response we've seen, 170 people donating so far $8,500, really is exciting. I'm very optimistic that over the next week or two we're going to be able to reach our goal and give this topic the type of journalism that it deserves, and the type of journalism that doesn't get done anymore by the legacy media. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is step in and fill a gap, because investigative journalism is a money pit. It not only doesn't make money, it costs just an absolute fortune with almost no return. And so that's why legacy outlets really don't like doing it so much anymore. So we're trying to step in and fill that gap, and hoping that you can donate and help us to do that.
Amazing. Wow. Now, I think I'm before I go to Jordy, I want to go to Thorben, because you've been doing advocacy in Canada for a while on this issue and working on this issue. Maybe talk a little bit about that and what excites you about this project.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've been doing advocacy on this issue together with literally everyone on the call here. I've been working on this since 2016, I believe, on regulation in Toronto and other parts of Ontario, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Ottawa. And I think what's really important here is that, in our advocacy work and in figuring out like what kind of regulations work, what kind of regulations don't work, what are the loopholes and all the rest of it, I think there are always a number of open questions that pop up that are very hard to get answers to. And I think, investigative journalism provides a very good avenue towards exploring some of these questions that really need some more detailed exploration and more resources and more time to really explore. And I think, if I have learned anything over the last couple of years, is that, we have never really achieved, like a situation where we say, okay, we're done with our work here, because things are evolving, the platforms are evolving, the platforms work around regulations, loopholes are popping up, governments are stepping in, both at the municipal and provincial levels. So I think, all this experience has, opened up a lot of questions. And I think, during the course of our conversation, I will throw out some of those as way markers for you to maybe take a look at if interested, and and also to hear and learn from other folks, particularly Murray and Jordy, what they see in their work on a day-to-day basis.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Thorben. I'm going to go to Jordy now and talk a little bit about, as Thorben said, you've been working on this for so long. How we met was I was rent evicted from an apartment, and that is how we first started talking. And you were so great during that period. And what would you like to see come out of this investigation?
I think I'd really like to see an investigation or come out of it as just the scale of the problem. How many units are we losing to Airbnb on the rental market, or on the kind of another kind of market that might be important, like ownership, and just how big of a penetration do you have in terms of the kind of lobbyist tentacles. My kind of journey with Airbnb, both personally and professionally, started a number of years ago, actually, in socialist Cuba. If you've ever vacationed in Cuba, you'll know that they run something called a Casa Particulara system, which is basically just like free rooms in a house, right? Which is kind of what I think Airbnb was sold to everyone as, right? It was one of these large tech companies that don't actually like own anything. Like Facebook and Twitter don't produce any content. We produce the content. Alibaba doesn't sell any goods. It's like a place to sell goods. And the same with Airbnb. It's like Airbnb doesn't own any of the real estate. It's a platform to get access to it. And you know, I think like Cuba uses their kind of spare rooms for the tourist industry. It's not an absurd idea, you know, using kind of spare capacity for, you know, more rental or maybe some like private vacation, some small time stuff. But kind of 4 or 5 years after Airbnb launch, we started noticing a very strong impact on the rental market. How we first heard about it was on our hotline, where we had tenants that were getting evicted to turn their unit into Airbnbs, which doesn't make any sense. You know, why would that be allowed, right? You're not allowed to just throw somebody out so you can turn it into a ghost hotel. There are specific reasons you're allowed to do it. And a lot of it was just brazenly illegal. But we started noticing it very frequently, very, very frequently. And that's kind of when I kind of started working on Airbnb and started getting provided numbers, I believe, from like Torben and Murray, which was showing the scale anywhere from like 8,000 to 12,000 units being pulled off the rental market. To give you an indication of what you're talking about there, you know, one of the mayoral candidates, I think Anna Balau, released her housing plan recently, and it said she's going to build 1,000 units by 2030. So if you're losing 8,000 units or 12,000 units, again, that's just a massive amount of rental stock. I mean, it might not sound like it, but you know, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 units, shifts like that can have a huge impact. And you really saw that during COVID. During COVID, rents went down, which is surprising because again, we're supposed to not have enough supply. In the areas where the rents went down hardest, was in Airbnb Central, right? Again, they stopped being able to rent those units out as hotels. They had to put them back on the rental market. Rent went down. Shocker. The final kind of area that I think I've really been involved with, or that's really shown me the impact of Airbnb, was actually a month ago. I was in Lisbon for the International Union of Tenants Conference. And they talked about 3 things at that conference, which to me shows you that the housing crisis is a global crisis. It's not limited to Canada or a couple markets. The top 3 issues that they raised were rent evictions, financialization of the housing market, and Airbnb. It could have been a Toronto regional conference. And this shows you that Airbnb isn't just having an impact in Canada in this negative way. It is like ripping apart rental markets across the globe. There's a famous district in Lisbon. It has had 25% loss in population, and 40% of the units in that area have been converted to Airbnbs. It has gutted that neighborhood and completely from kind of what it used to be a vibrant local community and turned it into a nightmare tourist trap and gutted the population by a quarter. So this is the impact that we're seeing in Lisbon. They've got good, hard, solid data on this stuff. And that's actually what I hope this project does here in Canada. It really kind of pulls back the curtain to show how destructive, how well connected, and how important this group is to the housing market in Canada. Thanks.
Wow. Well, that was a perfect segue. Oh, yep. Sorry, Ethan.
So you almost couldn't plan this if you tried, but as this panel is going on, as we're talking, Jonathan Goldsby, a journalist with Canadaland, tweeted earlier today, citing an article that was published in Ricochet about a week ago, where the Alberta NDP were unwilling to confirm whether Nathan Rotman, Airbnb's Canadian spokesperson, was running their campaign. Today, in the wake of that campaign, Nathan Rotman admitted that he was running that campaign. And he's now tweeting back at Jonathan Goldsby saying, and I quote, "You guys sure are upset that I took a holiday to work on a campaign. Have fun writing hit pieces with your pals." So I think it's just indicative of the attitude that Airbnb has. There's just no shame whatsoever. There's no acknowledgement that they have any culpability in anything. We're just jerks who are writing hit pieces about them because we're mean. And as sad as that is, I think it's important to know.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. Last but not least, I'm going to go to Murray Cox. And speaking of data and having the importance of data and having the being armed with data, but not just from a policy perspective and from an activist perspective, but from an individual perspective, knowing the extent of the problem and what you're up against as a tenant is critical. And so one of the people who have been doing incredible work on this to really arm us with that data is Murray Cox of Inside Airbnb. And so I'm going to turn it over to Murray now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andrea, for that introduction. So my name is Murray Cox. I run a project called Inside Airbnb. Since 2015, I've been collecting data on Airbnb around the world. I started in my neighborhood in Bedford-Stuyvesant in central Brooklyn, where I'd noticed tourists walking around this residential neighborhood that doesn't have hotels. And I wondered, I'd been doing some work on gentrification in the area, the rising cost of housing, evictions, the demographic changes in the neighborhood. And I was curious about Airbnb in my own neighborhood. There was no data available. Some journalists were using some static data, but they weren't releasing data. So I decided to get the data for myself and make it available to the public, and also build tools so that people can understand it. I now collect data on about 100 different cities, and I've started collecting data on entire countries. So I've been collecting data on Canada, and I hope to make that data available to the journalists in this campaign and in their stories. But what I find with my work is that you might have lost my video, but hopefully you can still hear me. What I find with my work is that even though I provide data and tools, you really need journalists to make the data relevant, to provide context, to walk people through the data, to investigate the data and find stories in the data. And so that's what I'm really looking forward to with this campaign, working with a number of investigative journalists over a period of time to really unlock the data and unlock the story and parse through all these issues. Frequently, there's a polarized debate on both sides of the issue. And so I think that there's a great role that journalists can play to really explain the issue to the public.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Murray. And hopefully we get your video back in a moment. It sometimes correct itself. Great. Thank you again, all of you, for joining me, and thank you for all of your work. And shout out to anybody in the audience or anybody watching at home. If you have stories, if you have questions, please bring it to us. There is the chat, and I can see it on YouTube. So if you type in a question, I will bring it to the panel. Likewise, if you tweet us or Facebook us or engage with us on any of our social channels, we will bring that question as well. Ethan will monitor the Ricochet channels. So I think right now I want to go quickly back to Jordy, and I want to hear a little bit more about some of the discussions at the conference that you mentioned, and hear a little bit more about what was proposed and talk a little bit more about what, I guess, what people at the conference want to see. What would the ultimate outcome of policies and regulations to Airbnb? What would the ideal regulation look like? Is that a provincial? Is it municipal? Is it federal? What did people at the conference say?
At the conference, it kind of depends on who you talk to. I think if you're talking to folks that have a strong taste for kind of strong government regulation, a lot of people just want the thing banned, like just get rid of it. There's a huge sector around tourism that can take care of kind of capacity issues in that environment, or can look at, building hotels or looking at bed and breakfast or something like that, or some kind of maybe short-term rental situation that's not as invasive and kind of taking a bunch of units off the market. So that's one thing that, again, a lot of people wanted to see, just like get rid of these operators that are cannibalizing our rental markets. That said, those are not often the people that are in power. You had mentioned the penetration that Airbnb executives have that go all the way to, a supposedly progressive government or supposedly a progressive party running in Alberta. But I've seen tremendous penetration here at City Hall. A lot of Airbnb executives were allied or former staff for Mayor Tory, I believe. And so again, they've got their hooks in at a lot of different levels. And because of that, a lot of times what people are doing in Europe is they're trying to come up with like some kind of regulatory system that allows Airbnb to exist, but really kind of keeps it out of certain markets. So for example, I mentioned in Lisbon, the Alfama market or area that had just been completely cannibalized. You can't actually build any Airbnb there anymore. You can't get a license. And if you can't get a license, you can't get on the platform. So they've essentially said, in these kind of like, what would be equivalent as the Toronto inner suburbs kind of areas, if you want to do Airbnb there, it's not having a major impact on the market. Go ahead. You're not going to get a huge flood of people that, come to Toronto and necessarily want to have their home base in Rexdale or, kind of these kind of northwest corners of the city. So, if you want to have an Airbnb there, go ahead. But keep it out of these kind of areas of the city and regulate it heavily. This is largely what some folks are trying to do. Just basically prevented kind of worst excesses and promote an area where it might not have as big of an impact. But they did implement rules like this in Lisbon and in other parts of Europe. And again, Airbnb just fights back as much as they can, so if they can, avoid having to implement a licensing system, and they can do what they did in Montreal, which is just say, oh, no, we have no idea what's going on in any of this stuff, then they're going to try and do something like that. And again, this is a cat and mouse game popping up throughout Europe, and also popping up in an interesting, unique regulatory framework. Right. Keep in mind, in Europe, you've got the EU that kind of like has a legislative kind of framework overseeing everything. And that legislative framework, again, isn't a progressive, left-wing utopia. It's largely giving a lot of power to investors and kind of investor rights. So, curtailing Airbnb has that kind of difficulty in it. But again, a lot of municipalities have been able to do so. And again, that's something that we'd like to see in a lot of places in Canada. Thanks.
Just wanted to chirp in and thank the anonymous donor who just made a $50 donation on our crowdfunder. Thank you very much. I assume that's somebody watching the live stream, unless it's a total coincidence.
Amazing. I'm going to throw it out to anybody. The panel as a whole can answer. But when we talk about regulation, and we do have a real patchwork, and I know as a team that's something that we talk about, is really getting a handle on what the regulations are across the country. Maybe the Montreal folks want to talk a little bit about what has happened as a result of the fire with regard to regulations. We have what looks to be a groundbreaking piece of legislation. We have one potentially in the pipeline for BC. Talk a little bit about this. Obviously the Montreal regulation that comes out of the fire, but what would make the most sense from your perspective? And is this a good thing? Is this what we want to see, or do we want to see more in line with what people were seeing at the conference? So maybe Ethan and Zach can start us off with this one.
Zach, you want to jump on that? What do you think about the legislation that's been proposed here in Quebec?
So
maybe explain what it is first and why it differentiates itself.
So for several years in Quebec, Airbnbs were supposed to be regulated, and you needed to apply for a license, and like a hotel license, through something called the CITQ, in order to be authorized to to rent for short term. This goes, I think, all the way back to 2018. And for pretty much that entire time, this wasn't enforced either at the provincial level, or if it was, very rarely, or on Airbnb's platform. So you could still have, up until the fire, ads for units that were not authorized. after the fire, there was moves fairly quickly to basically tell Airbnb that they need to verify or that people posting to Airbnb need to list their authorization number on the website. Almost immediately, fake numbers were popping up, and so illegal listings were remaining on the website. And this was pointed out by various news media. I think one of the most common numbers, and I think Murray actually, I remember Murray tweeted on Inside Airbnbs that like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 was like one of the most common CITQ numbers that was being listed on the website, and this is not a valid number. There's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 number. So more recently, there's been a proposal. I think it's waiting to be voted upon, that is basically going to fine. It's proposing fines for the platforms of up to $100,000 per listing that violates the law. So it's as far as I know, it's like in Quebec at least, it's the first time that the platform such as Airbnb will be held responsible for allowing illegal listings to be posted. The problem, at least in my eyes, with that kind of legislation, and while it is groundbreaking, I think in the country, that there's legislation being proposed that's going to hold Airbnb responsible for not enforcing the local laws, and then this is something that I'm going to look into more, and I'd like to report on, is like the process for being approved doesn't seem to be very strict either, and so it seems like pretty much anyone can apply for one of these licenses, and you pay the fees and you get your number, and voila, you're legitimate. And so, just today, I mean, there was a report in Le Devoir last month following the fire, looking into Emile Benamor, the owner of the building that burned down. And they had found another one of his buildings on Notre Dame Street was in fact converted to a 20-room hotel and a youth hostel, and both of those had legitimate CITQ numbers. So in those instances, he did apply to the province. He received authorization to convert what used to be long-term housing into short-term rentals. He got the permits, and the city in that case even allowed, when he applied for building permits from the city to convert into like a 20-room hostel, for instance. And the city approved plans that were, according to city code, violations, right? More windowless rooms. So despite the fact that this guy, I mean, this is before the fire, so he wasn't necessarily, under the microscope as he is today, but he applied to convert these long-term rentals into short-term rentals, to split up these rooms into much smaller rooms, some of which didn't conform to building code, was still approved by the architecture firm. It was approved by the city, and the province gave him a license to use these as hotels. So if that gives you any idea of the loopholes or the problems that exist, even with the proposals, I mean, I don't think it's going to solve anything really. Well, not everything.
Thanks so much, Zach. Yeah, I think we have some questions in the chat. I'm going to throw it to Ethan, who's going to read off some of the questions we've got coming in from all you watching at home.
Thanks, Andrea. So we've got a couple coming in. First of all, is more of a comment. Sophie Boudreau says that they lived in Victoria for 7 years and remembers before Airbnb, the cost of living was quote unquote normal. Units were available for $750 to $950 for one bedroom circa 2014. How much things have changed in a decade. And Jack Curry wants to know, are there approximate numbers or numbers by ward for how many units are operating in Toronto? So I don't know if maybe that's a good question. Who wants to take that question? Who has some ideas about what the prevalence is like in Toronto?
Corbin or Jordy?
Sure.
Maybe?
I mean, I can maybe start, and I'm sure Mary can jump in and provide some more precise numbers on Toronto's neighborhoods. What we have seen over the last couple of years is that the short-term rental activity in Toronto is really concentrated in the downtown core, in areas that are very walkable, that are transit-oriented, that have a high percentage of condominium buildings. And in Toronto sort of planning terms, there's one neighborhood, it's called the waterfront, Toronto waterfront communities, and that has always been, the vast majority of short-term rentals have been concentrated in this area. And we as Airbnb have released a number of reports over the years demonstrating how many units are being removed from this area, from the housing stock, particularly in the period before the city passed regulations in 2021. We also know that the Urban Research Lab out of McGill University is going to is doing some research on VC, and they are right now going over the numbers, particularly in areas like Victoria and Vancouver Island, some of the rural communities, literally showing for the first time the relationship between commercial short-term rental activity and the increase in rents and housing costs. And I think a number of academic studies have demonstrated this link in the United States and other parts, but not necessarily in Canada. So that will be very interesting when this research comes out to demonstrate what the impact has been on housing costs for tenants in British Columbia. The one thing that maybe I'll pass it on to Murray, but the numbers in Toronto were increasing pre-pandemic quite dramatically. Then we had a little dip, but I think they are like rebounding right now as we speak. And I'll pass it on to Murray because I'm sure that he has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I would just encourage anyone that's curious about the data for Canadian cities, go to Inside Airbnb. There's a page, Inside Airbnb/Toronto, and it's got a map of Toronto. We don't currently break it out by ward. We break it out by neighborhood, because usually we find sometimes these electoral boundaries are a little bit too large and they hide some of the local impacts. So we break out Toronto by neighborhood, and you can navigate, you can filter by neighborhood, you can look at the data across the city and also other major cities of Canada. And we're also planning on, over the next few months and possibly by this reporting, rolling out the data for the whole of Canada.
Wonderful. Well, that certainly would be a valuable resource for our reporters. I'm going to quickly go to Brishti, and I know that you're a little under the weather, so I'm not going to force you to talk for too long, but because BC it was mentioned, and you've talked about the rapid, escalation of rents, particularly in tourist areas, such as where you are in Victoria. And so, it's not just major cities. It's not just Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. We are seeing this penetration everywhere, especially tourist areas. So maybe you just want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing out west.
Yeah, in terms of the regulations here in BC, it's quite similar to other parts of Canada. In BC, regulations are really fragmented. It's up to municipalities and or strata councils to enforce short-term rental bylaws, which exist in Vancouver, Victoria, and Kelowna. I haven't quite looked into the links between Airbnb and rising costs just yet, not because we don't have that data just yet, but I do know that there is currently a petition in front of the BC Supreme Court in which the BC's Office of Information and Privacy Commissioner in 2021 ruled that the city of Vancouver should make short-term rental operator business licenses public, just like they do for hotels. And that petition is still in front of the BC Supreme Court because Airbnb, filed a challenge to that ruling. So regulations remain fragmented, even though they exist, quote unquote. There's been acknowledgement of the fact that there's not enough resources or, interest maybe to enforce those regulations. We see out here bylaw officers every morning in Victoria. In Victoria, just to give people a background, there's this 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. tenting bylaw for people who are unhoused, who can only put up tents in public spaces between the hours of 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. You see bylaw officers out there every single morning at 7 a.m. enforcing that bylaw, taking people's belongings, making sure that they're not visibly homeless. But there seems to be this disconnect where there aren't enough resources to enforce the bylaws that may prevent homelessness or precarious housing in the first place. So these are the issues that we really need to look into.
Such an important issue, how precarious everybody is right now with the housing crisis. We're all, most people are, in some cases, one financial crisis away from homelessness, or one paycheck away from being in a position where you are teetering on the verge of homelessness. And so I think those are really important questions. And it goes back to what Zach was talking about accountability and going after those accountability questions. And it also, goes to what Ethan was talking about earlier with politicians who maybe are deeply invested in Airbnb, both as a host themselves or through the lobby machine. In fact, Ethan, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the questions that we have about how and making those connections. Who is a host, who isn't a host, and how that might influence their position on this issue.
Thank you, Andrea. We've got, it's actually good timing because we've got somebody going by Kilgore Kraut on YouTube in the comments who's asking, has anyone brought up the extent to which politicians of all levels and parties are landlords and how it affects housing policy? And that, I think, is a key question. Airbnb is sort of low-hanging fruit. Airbnb is an app, a platform. It's designed to create value for its shareholders. It's not even based in this country. It's really no surprise that Airbnb doesn't care much what impact its operations have on the housing crisis. The real question, I think, is why politicians at all levels have done so little to regulate short-term rentals. Because as others have mentioned, when this started, short-term rentals are fine when it's like somebody renting out a spare room in their house, 1 month of the year or something like this. Like these type of little type of things that Airbnb started out with are fine. And then it became overnight this platform for running these massive, illegal, unregulated ghost hotels that don't follow, as we found out tragically with the Montreal fire a few months ago, don't follow even basic fire safety standards. So why did politicians allow this to happen? Why has there been so little action to regulate it? And we kind of have a sense of how many politicians are landlords, and it's a lot. I think over a third of federal members of parliament are landlords. We don't really know how many politicians at different levels are involved in short-term rentals specifically, because obviously that's quite different from just being a landlord. And so I think that's something that we're very excited with this project to dig into is to see, is there a connection between politicians who are themselves involved in the short-term rental industry and the reluctance on the part of politicians to do anything about these problems.
Yeah. I'm going to throw that one to Murray as well. And has this been a question that has come up in your research? Has this been something that you've looked at?
Well, there's definitely conflict of interest. I think when we deal with when we talk about real estate, the real estate market, it's obviously a power. There's a question of power, and the people that are legislating are sometimes those involved in the activity, whether as landlords, as investors. There's also an element of pay to play with short-term rental platforms like Airbnb donating to political campaigns. They're also there's been a lot of evidence in the US where they're hiring legislatures or people that have worked with legislatures as part of their lobbying team. At one stage, just prior to the pandemic, Airbnb had a communications budget of $100 million, and they had teams of lawyers that were frequently suing municipalities. And so I think that's another part of the story. We'll frequently find if you're able to access databases of donors and lobbyists, or if you're able to issue freedom of information requests, But you'll find that Airbnb and their lobbyists are meeting frequently with the legislators, and so it's a very common thing where these policies are being decided not based on information or urban planning in terms of how we should be using housing, but rather massive corporate lobbying.
Yeah, certainly the lobby machine is a major role, plays a major role in all of this. I think I'd like to go to Thorben now, and then Jordy, to talk a little bit about your thoughts on this and the role of the lobby machine, and how as investigative journalists we can both have that accountability piece of this investigation.
Sure.
I
mean, am I muted? No. Platforms are generally very smart. They have a lot of money, and they hire very good people, and they hire former White House advisors in the US, Chris Lehane, for example, that did a lot of Airbnb's bidding in the US, and on special occasions, has been flown to Toronto, before important votes and the rest of it. They hire formerly progressive people to do their lobbying work. They hire former union presidents. They reach out to progressive folks in the media and in economists and so on to help them sort of greenwash their company, and they have been very successful at this. And at the same time, I feel sort of the veneer of these big tech platforms has worn off. I think that is true across the spectrum. It's true with Google, it's true with Facebook, it's true with Uber, it's true with Airbnb. And they no longer can come into a community and say, hey, we have something really cool to offer, and people will make extra money, and they can make some, they can help. It'll help pay their mortgage or whatever. I think everyone knows by now that the reports are just out there for years now to show that Airbnb cannibalizes the housing market, systematically converts housing stock that has been planned, built, and realized as housing stock as hotel inventory. I think no one is fooled by their marketing anymore. I think there was a time when that may have been the case, but I think we're beyond that. In terms of regulating Airbnb, like, my experience is a little bit different. I find that in most jurisdictions, there are people that are actually keen on regulating it. The set of rules that come out are not always perfect, and they always try to strike a balance between allowing people to rent their own home and avoiding sort of the most drastic impacts on the housing market. But also what motivates a lot of decision makers that I found was that they really had negative experiences with Airbnbs. I had dealt with executive directors and EAs of decision makers that told me privately, we had a fucking ghost hotel next door, and we had to invest $20,000 to soundproof the walls because my kids couldn't sleep, and they were tired in the morning. Others were telling me that they had a ghost hotel across the street, across the hall in their condo, and people were vomiting in the floor, because they had raging parties on the weekend. So it seems like everyone had a story to tell, and it was always the balance between, do people want to regulate Airbnb because of the nuisance issue and the party house issue, or do they really care about housing markets? And I think in many ways you can bring those two pieces together, but unfortunately, what we also see is that regulation is often ineffective because jurisdictions don't have the resources to do proper enforcement. And I think Brishti brought up BC as an example, and I think that's why I wanted to loop back to BC, because the province there, is trying to implement a provincial-wide approach similar to Quebec, that helps municipalities that do not have the resources and the capacity to deal with these questions and do the enforcement, to help them with the enforcement and help them with the information needed in order to do proper enforcement and to know what's going on in their communities. So I think BC is on the way to possibly come out with a set of provincial approaches that may have learned also from the Quebec failures, and really hold platforms accountable for the content that they advertise and profit from. And we know that Airbnb already came out a few days ago following the Quebec announcement of Bill 25 to say, hey, it's not up to us to police the inventory. It's up to the government to make sure that people follow the rules, right? And that's similar position they've had for many years, that they try to download responsibility to follow local laws and regulations to tens of thousands of individuals that are very hard to pin down and very hard to go after and very hard to enforce, and do not want to take responsibility. And I find it's like Galen Weston tells you, well, whatever products are in our aisles in Loblaws, it's not up to us to ensure that they are safe, that they are not expired, that they are legal. Fuck, we have the government to come in here and walk the aisles to make sure that they pull out anything that doesn't really fit here, right? And I think that's what Airbnb and some of their Canadian spokespeople are trying to tell regulators, which is a complete bullshit, right? I think governments need to hold the company accountable for the products that they sell and that they peddle in, whether this is Airbnb or whether this is Google or Facebook. I think it's time to hold these platforms accountable.
Such a
Here's
great
a quote.
point. Yeah, exactly. Oh my God, such a great point. And you reminded me of the reporting that came out of Montreal, Zach's incredible reporting from the fire and the health and safety fire codes that were completely disregarded. Windows were nailed shut, so people were trapped. The question obviously remains is how extensive is this problem? If it happened there, where else is it happening? And what other jurisdictions?
The same in Toronto in 2017. We highlighted an issue on Dundas Street West where a person turned 2 or 3 buildings into ghost hotels by turning the apartments above the stores into 28 different units with no fire exits. They were literally death traps in the sky. The fire marshal shut these places down in 2017. We come across these things over time. And unfortunately, we also had to deal with this terrible fire in Montreal that cost so many lives. But it's not new. And, people have tried to use the platform as a vehicle to make a lot of money on the backs of their communities and their neighbors and tenants. And, I think it's time to come up with an enforcement mechanism to hold these platforms accountable for the content that they profit from.
Absolutely. Death traps in the sky. Absolutely. Ethan, I'm going to throw it to you because you got some questions here in the YouTube chat.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. We've got some more comments from Kilgore Kraut, noting the Alberta NDP being very shady over whether an Airbnb executive was working on their campaign. So just quickly for people that aren't aware, Nathan Rotman is the former executive director of the federal NDP. He's somebody I actually know from back in the day. He was heavily involved with the NDP. He left in order to take a job as the primary spokesperson for Airbnb in Canada, and I think now also in the northeastern United States. And that's one thing. It's hard to expect a political party to police where its senior executives go after they leave. But what happened recently, obviously there was an Alberta election that just concluded yesterday, and Nathan Rotman took a leave of absence from Airbnb to go and actually run the Alberta NDP's campaign. And so I think that's raised a lot of red flags with people who are wondering whether the NDP and certainly the Alberta NDP in particular can be trusted on housing when they're literally recruiting Airbnb's top spokesperson, someone who just a few months ago in the wake of the fire in Montreal was running away from reporters asking questions like, what do you say to the families? I mean, it's kind of a new low and inconceivable to me that politics has gotten so bad in this country that the ostensibly left-wing party, the party that is ostensibly supposed to be representing renters, supposed to be representing people that are being victimized by Airbnb and by this housing crisis, is putting somebody in charge of their campaign whose most recent CV credit is running away from reporters who are asking him, what do you say to the families? What kind of a political party hires somebody like that, puts somebody like that in charge of their campaign? So, and as I mentioned earlier on the live stream, Nathan Rotman just a few minutes ago tweeting at Jonathan Goldsby with Canadaland, being really snarky and aggressive with him for having the temerity to call this out. And I mean, like, you know, Nathan Rodman's reputation is trash at this point, but what's the NDP doing? Why would, you know, the guy is not a magician. Why would you go back to him? Why would you not hire somebody else to run your campaign? So, and then Kilgore Crowd also had another comment about the Tenant Act enforcement being woefully underfunded, and that being to an extent intentional. So does anybody want to talk about the distinction between the rules that we have sometimes and the enforcement? Because I know in particular in Quebec, that's often an issue. In Quebec, we often have very strong legislation, a lot of it dating back to the 70s and very populist social democratic governments. And then progressive governments haven't gotten rid of that legislation, but they've just gutted the ability to enforce it. So do we see that same thing in housing and in different jurisdictions where there's a gap between the regulation and how it's enforced? I guess, yeah, sure, Jordy.
You know, I in addition to working for the Tenant Federation, I've done some journalism myself with a number of outlets. And one of the things I always find interesting about the defunding the police kind of debate is that in large swaths of our society, the police are already effectively defunded. You know, Galen Weston ran a bread fixing cartel with 11 other conglomerates, no criminal charges. The number one type of theft that occurs in Canada and throughout North America, by far, like by a factor of like 10 to 1, is wage theft. It's not a crime. You know, and I can show you this over and over again. You know, I think the current budget chief of Toronto, Gary Crawford, Globe and Mail said he was mobbed up with a fixer right before the last election. And, you know, then Tory came out, you know, throwing money at the police. And I don't think those two things are related, but what if they are? You know, again, this is like, what investigation was there? You know, Rob Ford was famously, you know, doing things that lawyer Clayton Ruby was just like, if any of my clients did this stuff, they'd be charged, right? Again, defunded. And this is hard because I think there's a huge swath of kind of progressive folks that want to abolish the police. And I understand that completely, the kind of realms for it, the rationale for it. And the hard part for me is, you know, I often work with tenants who they want kind of more landlord police. They want someone that's actually going to step in and force the landlord to do repairs. They want someone actually issuing criminal negligence charges against the landlord in Montreal. Because it was obviously criminal negligence, right? I see this happen all the time with the rooming houses. There's a lot of illegal rooming houses, a lot of fires, people die in them, and then the person gets charged under like the Fire Act, and I'm like, why aren't they being criminally charged? Effectively, it's because the police have been defunded for that. And that's the same thing for Airbnb, right? Airbnb has been breaking rules across the board. It is part of their business plan. Ignore municipal bylaws, do what, you know, Torben said, like try to download enforcement to anybody else other than them, and operate, you know, in this totally illegal zone that's totally, with police and law enforcement, totally defunded. Again, I think the easiest way to do this is the way we do it in almost any other business, you know, Airbnb, regulate your damn providers, or else we are going to, you know, fine you or criminally charge you into oblivion. And again, a lot of companies have faced that, and most companies comply, and some that don't get sent off into oblivion. And again, that's the way you often deal with any kind of actor like this. The big problem, and I think this goes back to kind of earlier points on the lobbying discussion. You know, I think to the average kind of person out there, lobbying is kind of thought of as this kind of cabal, right? It's thought of as there's a secret meeting. The Airbnb execs are kind of telling people one thing. The politicians are going, yeah, and you know, we get how this really works. We're going to snow the public. You know, I've had some experience with this stuff, and it almost never works that way. I mean, it does work that way sometimes, but usually how it is just politicians listen to the people who are around them. They just listen to the people who are around them, and a lot of politicians are rich, and so they just listen to their rich friends. And a lot of politicians get lobbied a lot, not by the tenant federation, who doesn't have a lobbyist person, who doesn't really have any money. Like, we get a shoestring budget and try to do the best we can. We can't send a lobbyist in a suit to every single councillor on a 3-month cycle for every piece of legislation. But Airbnb can, and Airbnb does, and so does the landlord lobby. And a lot of times I think like that's just it. Like, a lot of politicians are rich, they live in a bubble, and they don't interact with any tenants at all. You know, I think the federal housing minister only interacts with tenants when they're paying him rent, because he's a landlord. I think that's the only time he ever probably speaks to a tenant or talks to a tenant group. He's, you know, we're the tenant federation in Fortress Toronto for the federal Liberals. You know, we represent half the city of Toronto. They've never met with us. They've never asked to meet with us. They don't even know we exist. All right. And that's because, again, they just don't care about that subset of the population. You know, how I've seen that played out in Ontario at the government level. The previous Liberal government, they invited me to a panel on Airbnb and innovation. You know, they just saw Airbnb as this innovative new tech tool. They had no idea about any of the negative consequences, and they didn't really care. They just saw it as like one of these tech companies that are changing the way business is going to happen, and they wanted to kind of facilitate that. No analysis of anything else. The current provincial Conservative government, the very far start of their first term, they ran like a supply consultation. You know, we didn't really trust them to give a damn about tenants, but you know, we always at least try to. Maybe they do, maybe we have misconceptions. So we took part in that consultation. We said, hey, you want to know how you can add 12,000 units of rental supply like overnight, no money? Like, you don't have to spend anything. You don't have to wait for construction. You can do all this stuff. And their response, I think, was very telling. A reporter was just like, how do you feel about this? Like, adding supply? And they were like, oh, yeah, we didn't even really look at that. Like, again, it was just obvious that they didn't even care. Because, again, it was coming from the tenant federation. It's not coming from a billionaire developer. It's not coming from a billionaire landlord. They're not going to listen to it, right? So, again, I think this is how these things often play out. And I'll let, I think Torben wants to jump in, so I'll let him go there.
Thanks, Jody. I did want to remind you, though, that when we worked on regulations in Toronto together with you and a whole bunch of coalition partners, we actually won a unanimous vote to regulate the company and to make sure that only principal residences can be rented out, which at that point we thought would remove thousands of units from Airbnb's platform. That was what everyone expected. But once these regulations came into effect in January of 2021, what Airbnb did, instead of unloading all those listings that were not occupied by principal residences and were essentially illegal, they just unilaterally changed their booking terms to 28 days or more, which meant that they would not be bound by Toronto's new short-term rental bylaw, which is defined by 28 days or less. And now we have seen an inversion of what's going on the platform. In the past, you had like 75 to 80% short-term rentals, maybe 20% of long-term rentals of 30 days or more. Now we have 75% of long-term rentals on the platform and only about 25% of short-term rentals that you can rent for less than 28 days. So, you know, the vast majority of Airbnb's inventory in Toronto is for, you know, so-called long-term rentals of 28 days plus. And we don't know what's happening with that inventory. Like, ideally, we would have liked to see this all being, you know, delisted off Airbnb's platform and reintroduced into the housing market as units for people to live in. But we know they are parked on Airbnb's platform. They're probably not paying empty homes tax. And, you know, people have found a way of utilizing these properties in a way that we're not quite clear about. But I think what the important lesson here is that even if we organize and we come together and we lobby against Airbnb and for regulations to protect the housing market and we get rules in place, platforms have the ability to change things internally to get around existing regulations. And that's exactly what Airbnb has done in Toronto. They have just tweaked their booking mechanism in a way that allows them to retain. Right now, I don't know, Murray would know, we probably have like 15,000 or so units sitting on Airbnb as so-called long-term rentals. And it is not, you know, uncommon for people that come to Toronto to find a first place on a platform like Airbnb for a couple of months. But do those folks that rent through Airbnb have tenants' rights? I'm sure Jordi would say they do. But it's unclear. Their relationship is not structured through an Ontario lease agreement, but through a service agreement between a platform that mediates the tenant and the owner. It's currently in front of the landlord-tenant board, a case where they kind of make a determination as to whether a family that has lived in an Airbnb that was rented through an Airbnb for more than 6 months, whether those folks are being protected as tenants or not in the province. So I think it opens up a whole new set of questions for tenants in Ontario if Airbnb continues to force its way into the long-term rental market, and the few units that are available in a place like Toronto will only be accessible through a platform that is, a Silicon Valley-based platform that doesn't pay taxes in Canada and, has 35 subsidiaries that are set up in a way that they get around all kinds of rules and regulations around the world. So I think that's important to think about that. Yes, we can have wins and we can also influence regulations, but these platforms find ways to almost invert things.
God, that's scary. So I just wanted to quickly come back to something Jordi was saying earlier about enforcement, because I think it's a really good point. If you hear any background noise from my end, it's because right out of my window, there's a gutting of a building. What used to be an apartment building, it's being gutted. It's going to go back on the market at the very top price, or it's going to, actually, that one has been an Airbnb hotel in the past. It probably will be an Airbnb hotel again. And so, often I talk to my city councilor. He's actually a pretty good city councilor. His name's Craig Sauvé. He's got a position. He wants to ban Airbnb, wants to get rid of Airbnb totally. He's a pretty left-wing guy. But when I talk to him and I say, look, when we call and people are doing something illegal, they're doing something without a permit, there's no inspectors to show up. We need more inspectors. He makes an argument in response to that that's like, well, but do we really want more enforcement? Do we want, inspectors on every corner? And he sort of likens it to policing and likens it to the unintended consequences of policing, that if we have, higher levels of enforcement, you get unintended consequences. And I think it's really important to push back on that, because what we have in this society is massive over-policing of the most vulnerable members of society. If you're homeless, if you're on the street, if you have substance abuse problems, you are going to deal with cops all the time. Cops are going to be up in your business constantly. But if you are a rich landlord who is gutting your buildings in order to turn them into Airbnb hotels, who is acting with total impunity to the neighbors, to the neighborhood, not bothering to get permits, not bothering to follow the rules, there's almost no enforcement. So, these are not comparable things. You can't compare them and say, well, look, over policing of the most vulnerable is bad, therefore we shouldn't be enforcing regulations on the richest members of society. It's the opposite. We need to take some of those resources away from harassing the most vulnerable members of society and make sure that the richest members of society are following the rules, are paying the taxes and the permit fees that they need to be paying, and are respecting their neighbors as a bare minimum. As a bare minimum. Obviously, renovictions are something that need to be tackled on a policy front, but at the bare minimum, yeah, let's have more enforcement to make sure that the rich are following the rules. Oh, you're muted, Andrea.
Muted, sorry. Just to remind everybody that we are crowdfunding for this investigation, and if you can donate, if you know somebody who's interested in this issue and is also in a position to donate, we're very grateful for all the contributions so far, and if you can contribute again, we'd be very appreciative. We are crowdfunding to pay 4 journalists a living wage to investigate this issue and really do a deep dive and start making those connections and piecing together the human interest stories, what we need to know, what are the regulations across the country. Let's start collecting that data, some of the incredible work that Murray has done. We want to really advance that work and really bring it to life with stories, personal stories. We want to hear from you. What is the experience that you've had? Have you been rent evicted? Please tell us about it. You can email me directly at ricochet.media, and I will certainly get any of your comments and questions to the panel or to our team if you have a story that you'd like to share. Please donate to our crowdfunder. The address to do that is gofundme.com/investigating-Airbnb, and just look us up on ricochet.media. You can find the link there. And so before we start to wrap up, and I want to just last chance for anybody watching, if you have questions for our panel, please put that in the YouTube chat. We're monitoring it. I do want to go to Murray once again, and so when we, especially looking at, we haven't really talked a bit about some of the stuff that I've heard you talk about your work about the equality piece of this, and who profits from Airbnb and who isn't profiting, and what some of the data that you've done actually shows. Maybe you want to talk a little bit anecdotally about what has been revealed to you in New York, that Airbnb has marketed itself towards as a solution for people to help make ends meet, to communities that are maybe living on the poverty line. You can make a little extra cash by renting, but we know your room out, but we know who mostly is the hosts and the landlords in this situation. And I find it really interesting that your data has really revealed some of this equality piece, which is certainly something that we would like to look at as well. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you about the work that you've done with regard to this.
Yeah, I'll try and talk briefly about it. So I think some of the other panelists have mentioned some of the selling points about short-term rentals, that you can use the extra income to pay the rent or pay the mortgage. And frequently, a lot of the surveys that the platforms themselves run or commission come up with those types of outcomes. I would probably assume that they're skewed in terms of who they ask, and the people that they ask, the hosts that they ask, know very well what the answers are going to be used for lobbying and talking about only the positive benefits. But when I started my project in 2015, I had been experimenting with creating some maps of Airbnb in Bedford-Stuyvesant, in Brooklyn, and across New York City. And some of the original maps that I started using, instead of putting a colored dot on the map, I put the host's face on the map. And I didn't end up using that map, but it was pretty obvious in my neighborhood. I lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's in the center of Black Brooklyn, historically Black Brooklyn. And a curious thing that I found, or a concerning thing that I found, is that most of the dots on the map were not Black faces, but white faces. Not all of them, but a majority of them. And at that time, the neighborhood was probably only about 20%, 10 or 20% white. And so a few years later, I was thinking about this. I mentioned I hadn't used those maps because I wanted to talk about mainly the housing issue and not who was benefiting or who was actually using Airbnb. But I revised it a few years later, and instead of making that map with faces, I decided to racially code the host pictures across every Airbnb rental in New York City. And I know that there are some concerns with this type of activity using image recognition and the biases with image recognition. And so I did it with a lot of care. I consulted some people at Harvard Business School that had done the same thing with both technology and also humans that were, or people that were racially coding the data. And so this was at the same time that Airbnb had been promoting stories about how Airbnb was benefiting low-income neighborhoods in New York City and also Black neighborhoods in New York City. But the obvious question was, who was actually benefiting? Who was using it in those neighborhoods? And so when I racially coded the hosts in predominantly Black neighborhoods, so where there's a majority Black population across New York's neighborhood, I found that there were disparities of 500% compared to the underlying demographic. So for argument's sake, let's say the demographic was 10% white in the population, the Airbnb hosts would have been 50% white. And so in my own neighborhood, there was an 1,000% disparity. And so even if you take race out of that research, it was showing that these newer entrants or investors were investing in these neighborhoods that were Black and gentrifying, and they were using Airbnb as a gentrification tool. And so I think this would apply to a lot of both racially gentrified neighborhoods, but also just gentrified neighborhoods where investors, people with money, people with capital, people that can get a lease and they can flip it onto Airbnb, they're using it as an economic tool. And so I think that was really concerning to me. And that study was, I think, instrumental in, I think, turning some of the tide in New York City. And we recently passed really strong regulations, registration system, platform accountability, a 5-point matching system so that people can't use fake numbers, and also data sharing. So yeah, I think the research was really concerning, and I think people should probably think about that in terms of who's actually using and benefiting from tools like Airbnb.
Yeah, it was very eye-opening when I was reading about your research and about that issue. It's because it makes total sense that would be the results. There's another question in the YouTube chat that I'm going to throw out to everyone, but first I'm going to throw it to Jordy. Are there groups like tenants unions organizing tenants of a particular buildings or property companies? It seems like that would be a good way to go about coordinated action, such as rent strikes. And I know that this is obviously something that is happening in some communities. Jordy, you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible to organize around Airbnb, but part of the issue is sometimes it happens on a unit by unit basis. It is not unheard of, but it's pretty rare that a landlord will try to evict an entire building to turn it into an Airbnb. When they do, there's an obvious appetite and ability and strong desire for folks to kind of organize around that and stop it. But again, this isn't impossible, but it's a lot less frequent when it's kind of 1 or 2 units. We deal with this a lot where tenants are facing some kind of eviction. Like in a house, for example, where the landlord wants to gut, 3 units in a house, Airbnb the whole thing, or maybe do what kind of Corbin had mentioned, maybe turn it into 28 illegal micro units to really cash in, right? And when they're doing this, again, there are ways to push back. It just can be difficult when there are fewer tenants. And that's because, most people, when they rent an apartment, they don't do so on the basis that they want to get into a years-long organizing fight with their landlord, right? Like most people, their home is their sanctuary. They just want to come home and relax. And this landlords and property owners use this against people all the time. It's actually the most common tactic that we see. Not that I'm going to take you to court or not that I'm going to do anything. I'm just going to give you a simple sheet of paper that's an eviction notice, and I'm going to watch as you spend the next 3 weeks, sleepless nights and stress about that because you don't know where you're going to be now in 6 months, right? You might win, but you might not. You might win at court. Landlord might take it to court, might not. That just level of uncertainty drives so many people to move out when they don't have to. And again, it's understandable because you can imagine that scenario yourself. You get an eviction notice today. Can you plan next year's vacation? No, you don't know if you're going to be in the same house. Can you family plan? No, you don't know if you're going to be. You don't know where you're going to be, right? That level of uncertainty just, again, is a cudgel that they browbeat tenants with all the time. And again, it's often, in our experience, completely fraudulent. So you're not allowed to evict a tenant to Airbnb the unit. But again, eviction fraud has been totally defunded when it comes to police. It's criminal fraud. The police should be able to get in there and say, you've defrauded this person of their contract under false pretenses. you can't do that. That's a criminal charge. But again, the police, the only time I've ever seen the police engage in a landlord and tenant matter on fraud was to beat up on some tenant. Some poor mentally ill tenant that obviously wasn't a very good tenant. That's when they'll issue criminal charges. When an Airbnb unit is doing criminal negligence and burning people alive to death, again, criminal charges, I don't think we've seen any in Montreal. But they absolutely could be brought. Again, it's criminal negligence is a criminal offense. But again, if you're a rich property owner, again, the police have effectively been defunded. So again, we estimate between 40 to 60,000 incidences of eviction fraud happening every year in Ontario. Not a single charge. And in fact, the government is not only doing nothing about that, they're trying to facilitate it in some ways by making certain illegal behaviors legal if you don't catch them in time. So again, this is the kind of enforcement environment that we're operating in. Again, if you're rich, defunded, and if you're poor, again, police will come down on you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Well, I'm going to go around the panel and let everybody give final thoughts before we wrap it up. Thank you again for everyone watching at home and all your questions. It has been really, really informative. I just find this a collection of ideas, and this panel is so great. I could just keep talking for hours, but we're all busy. So I'm going to go around, starting with Zach. Final thoughts.
It's just been really great to be able to sit here and listen to all of you speak about this, and I'm really excited to really dig in and start looking through the data that's been gathered and try and bring this more into the public conversation. We really need to we were reliant on your donations, so if you could go to the GoFundMe, I'd really appreciate it. And then thanks for listening today.
Amazing. Rishti.
Yeah, this is a really enlightening conversation. I've come out with many more questions than answers, which is always a good sign at the beginning of any investigation. So thank you to Murray, Thorvin, Jordy for sharing all of your expertise with us. And as Zach mentioned, we haven't begun this investigation in earnest yet. We're waiting for our crowdfunder to hit its goal. So if you could please donate, it would mean a lot. It basically means that we don't have to scrimp for money as we as we do this work. So thank you to everyone who's watching as well, and thanks Ethan and Andrea.
Amazing. Thorvin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you everyone. It was a pleasure being here, and you're doing very, very important work. So I'm very happy to be there as a resource. Whenever you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help. In any way I can. And so, thank you so much for inviting us and for the work that you're doing.
Ethan.
Thanks, Andrea. First of all, I just want to say what an incredible team this is. And this is only just a little part of it. It's such an incredible team of journalists to work with, and I'm so thankful to be able to work with them. So thankful to the experts that we have here and the incredible work that they've done. Inside Airbnb, Fairbnb, the Metropolitan Tenants Association are such critical resources for people who are trying to maintain democratic control over what is really a runaway platform monopoly in terms of Airbnb. And I do just want to note as we go that Nathan Rotman is on a blocking spree. He's just blocked Sam Harper, one of our investigative journalists in Quebec. He's blocked Zach Kamal. So I think it's interesting just that even as we're having this conversation, Airbnb's primary spokesperson is on Twitter being snarky and blocking people. And it feels like an illustration of the problem that we're dealing with here, that there's no adults in the room at Airbnb. It's all just like a bunch of, meme culture edgelords. We've seen Elon Musk take over Twitter, and clearly Nathan Rotman is doing his best Elon Musk impersonation on Twitter today. So I hope we're able to hold them accountable and provide good data and information to the public.
Jordy, over to you.
Nathan just blocked me as well during this call or during this panel. You know, as folks working kind of in our economy, in our fast-paced economy, there's huge changes that are happening at a very rapid rate. You know, 20 years ago, Facebook didn't exist, and now it's you know, a dominant kind of media empire. And I think, you know, 15 years ago, we didn't even know Airbnb was on the market, and now it is kind of just pushed to the forefront, not just in Canada but around the world. And when things like this happens, folks in my position, we always feel like we're playing a game of catch up. You know, there's been major changes in the rental market in Canada in the last 10 years. And figuring out why and when and all the levers is very difficult. Like, I'm still trying to figure this stuff out today. And I'm, you know, debating people about, you know, zoning regulations and immigration and capital investment and stuff like that. And a lot of times it's very unclear what's happening, and you've got to do a lot of work and research and fact checking to kind of get to that. So I can't tell you how wonderful it is to see Ricochet and a media group kind of getting ahead of the game a little bit here, and really trying to dig into a company that I don't think has had people really dig into it in a way that's necessary. And to do that kind of proactively, a little bit reactively. I know there's been this fire and tragedy, but the facts that you folks are trying to, again, pool money on this issue and tackle it head on is very rare in the media landscape. You know, wouldn't expect this from the Globe or CBC or anything like that. So very excited that you folks are doing that, and very happy to see and happy to support it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but not least, over to Murray.
Well, thanks, Rona. I'm just really excited to collaborate, to potentially help with the research, and also read the final stories. I just want to encourage everyone to participate in the GoFundMe so these fine journalists can have a living wage to complete their research and the stories. Yeah, but I'm really looking forward to that, and thanks for having me today.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. Thank you for all your work. Thank you for all your engagement in this issue and this project that we're trying to get off the ground. Thank you to all of you who engaged on the chat, who shared and helped us promote and spread the word. And certainly thank you to everybody who has donated. Keep spreading the GoFundMe. Talk to your rich uncle or your aunt who you know who maybe owes you some bit of money for birthdays past or whatever. Get the word out, help us raise the money to pay these incredible journalists at a living wage to investigate this issue and really make the connections for Canadians. And as we've said, this is a global problem. So we're going to try and put Canada in context with the rest of the world as well. So with that, thank you again, and we will see you on Ricochet. So go to ricochet.media and find out more. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much, everybody. Oh, hey, it's just us.
Okay, it's us. Oh, God, close the.